Hi, everyone. Annette here, also known as Grandma D. Uh, I'm here tonight for another story time video. I'm so excited. As you're watching this, it's Wednesday evening, and we are going to read the second story in the series, Six by Seuss, written by the famous Dr. Seuss. This is a wonderful book full of just a treasure trove of rhymes and fun and laughter. And I think you're going to really love it. Our second story tonight is The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. This is a good story, and I hope that you'll love it as much as I do. Uh, just wanted to mention that if you have a favorite pet, um, whether it's a dog, a cat, a bird, a fish, a pig, a goat, a parakeet, whatever you have, um, I would love to feature your pet on a future Storytime video. So, what I would like for you to do is to send me a picture of just your pet, not you, because we want to keep you safe. Just a picture of your pet with your adult's permission, and have your first name, your pet's name, and if your adult is comfortable, the person who takes care of you, if they're comfortable with it, for maybe the state where you live, or the country, or the province if you're in Canada, wherever you are in the world. And I will feature your pet's photo and mention you and your pet's name in a future video. So if you would like to see that, you can hard mail it to me at the address below in the mail, or you can email it to me at grandmad2024@gmail.com. And I will make that happen. So without further ado, let's get right into our story. Today's story is The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. In the beginning, Bartholomew Cubbins didn't have 500 hats. He had only one hat. It was an old one that had to have belonged to his father and his father's father before him. It was probably the oldest and plainest hat in the whole kingdom of Did, where Bartholomew Cubbins lived. But Bartholomew liked it, especially because of the feather that always pointed straight up in the air. Look at that. The kingdom of Did was ruled by King Derwin. His place stood high on top of the mountain. From his balcony, he looked down over the houses of all his subjects. First, over the spheres of the noblemen's castles, across the broad roofs of the rich men's mansions, then over the little houses of the townsfolk, to the huts of the farmers far off in the fields. It was a mighty view, and it made King Derwin feel mighty important. He looks like he thinks he's pretty important. Far off in the fields, on the edge of Cranberry Bog, stood the hut of the Cubbins family. From the small door, Bartholomew looked across the huts of the farmers to the houses of the townsfolk, then to the rich man's mansions and the noblemen's castles, up to the great towering palace of the king. It was exactly the same view that King Derwin saw from his balcony. But Bartholomew saw it backwards. It was a mighty view, but it made Bartholomew Cubbins feel mighty small. The king's castle is way up there at the top of the hill. Bartholomew is way down here at the bottom. Just after sunrise, one Saturday morning, Bartholomew started for town. He felt very happy. A pleasant breeze whistled through the feather in his hat. In his right hand, he carried a basket of cranberries to sell at the market. He was anxious to sell them quickly and bring the money back home to his parents. He walked faster and faster till he got to the gates of town. The sound of silver trumpets rang through the air. Hoofbeats clattered on the cobbled streets. "Clear the way! Clear the way! Make room for the king!" There's the trumpets blowing, and the king is coming. People are watching. There's Bartholomew with his basket of cranberries. All the people rushed for the sidewalks. They drove their carts right up over the curbstones. Bartholomew chuckled his basket, or clutched. Bartholomew clutched his basket tighter. All around the corner dashed 50 trumpeters on yellow-robed horses. Behind them, crimson-robed horses of the king's own guards. "Hats off to the king!" shouted the captain of the king's own guards. On came the king's carriage, white and gold and purple. It rumbled like thunder through the narrow street. It swept past Bartholomew, then suddenly its mighty brakes shrieked. It lurched and it stopped. The whole procession stood still. Bartholomew could hardly believe what he saw. Through the side window of the carriage, the king himself was staring right back. Straight back at him. Bartholomew began to tremble. "Back up!" the king commanded the royal coachman. The royal coachman shouted to the royal horses. The king's own guards shouted to their crimson-robed horses. The trumpeters shouted to their yellow-robed horses. Very slowly, the whole procession backed down the street until the carriage stopped right in front of Bartholomew. Look at that. It looks like a giant pumpkin. The king leaned from his carriage window and fixed his eyes directly on Bartholomew Cubbins. "Well? Well?" he demanded. Bartholomew shook with fright. "I ought to say something," he thought to himself, but he could think of nothing to say. "Well?" demanded the king again. "Do you or do you not take off your hat before the king?" "Yes, indeed, sir," answered Bartholomew, feeling greatly relieved. "I do take my hat off before my king." "Then take it off this very instant," commanded the king more loudly than before. "But, sire, my hat is off," answered Bartholomew. Sorry, my phone was ringing. You'll have to excuse me. "Such impudence!" shouted the king, shaking an angry finger. "How dare you stand there and tell me your hat is off?" "I don't like to say you are wrong, sire," said Bartholomew very politely, "but you see, my hat is off." And he showed the king the hat in his hand. "If that's your hat in your hand," demanded the king, "what's that on your head?" "On my head?" gasped Bartholomew. There did seem to be something on his head. He reached up his hand and touched his hat. Look at that. He's got one in his hand, yet there's another one on his head. I wonder how that happened. The face of Bartholomew Cubbins turned very red. It's a hat, sire, he stammered. But it can't be mine. Someone behind me must have put it on my head. I don't care how it got there, said the king. You take it off. And the king sat back in his carriage. Bartholomew quickly snatched the hat off. He stared at it in astonishment. It was exactly the same as his own hat, the same size, the same color, and it had exactly the same feather. By the crown of my feathers, roared the king, again leaning out of the carriage window. Did I or did I not command you to take off your hat? You did, sire. I took it off. I took it off twice. Nonsense! There's still a hat upon your head. Another hat? Again Bartholomew reached up his hand and touched the hat. Come, come. What is the meaning of all this? Demanded the king, his face purple with rage. I don't know, sire, answered Bartholomew. It never happened to me before. The king was now shaking with such fury that the carriage rocked on its wheels and the royal coachman could hardly sit in his seat. Arrest this impudent trickster, shouted the king of the captain of the king's own guards. We'll teach him not to take off his hat. The royal coachman cracked his long whip. The king's carriage swung forward up the street towards the palace. But the captain of the king's own guards leaned down from his big brass saddle and grabbed Bartholomew by his shirt. Away flew Bartholomew's basket. The cranberries bounced all over the cobblestones and rolled into the gutter. With the jangling of spurs and a clatter of horseshoes, the captain and Bartholomew sped up the winding street towards the palace. Out of the narrow streets and up the hill, Bartholomew clung to the captain's broad back. On and on they galloped, past the bright gardens of the wealthy merchants, higher and higher up the mountain, on past the walls of the noblemen's castles. I think Bartholomew's in trouble. I wonder where he's going. Look at the hats. Flying off. Flop! The sharp wind whisked off Bartholomew's hat. Flop, flop! 2 more flew off. Flop, flop, flop! Flew another. And another. 4, 5, 6, 7. Bartholomew kept counting as the hats came faster and faster. Lords and ladies stared from the windows of their turrets, wondering what the strange stream of hats could mean. Over the palace drawbridge, they sped through the great gates and into the courtyard. The captain pulled in his reins. His Majesty waits in the throne room, said a guard, saluting his captain. The throne room, the captain dropped Bartholomew to the ground. I'd certainly hate to be in your shoes, he said, shaking his head steadily. For a moment, Bartholomew felt terribly frightened. Still, he thought to himself, the king can do nothing dreadful to punish me because I really haven't done anything wrong. It could be cowardly to feel afraid. Bartholomew threw back his shoulders and marched straight into the palace. Follow the black carpet, said the guard at the door. All through the long hallway, Bartholomew could hear the muttering of voices behind the heavy doors. He won't take off his hat. No, he won't take off his hat. These pages are still together. Bartholomew walked on till he stood in the very middle of the throne room. The king, in a long scarlet robe, was sitting on his throne. Beside him stood Sir Arilac, keeper of the king's records. He wore in his belt, instead of a sword, a long silver ruler. Lords and noblemen of the courtroom stood solemn and silent. The king looked down at Bartholomew severely. "Young man, I'll give you one more chance. Will you take off your hat for your king?" "Your Majesty," said Bartholomew, as politely as he possibly could, "I will, but I'm afraid it won't do any good." As he took off his hat, and it didn't do any good. Another hat sat on Bartholomew's head. He took off hat after hat after hat after hat until he was standing in the middle of a great big pile of hats. The lords and noblemen were so astonished they couldn't even speak. Such a thing had never happened in the throne room before. There's the keeper of the records and the king. Poor Bartholomew, way down here coming down the black carpet. "Heavens," said Sir Ariac. I can't even say it. Ariac, keeper of the records, blinking behind his triangular spectacles. "He's taken off 45. And there were 3 more down in the town," said the king. "And you must add on the 87 more that blew off my head as we galloped up the hill," said Bartholomew, trying to help. 135 hats. "Most unusual," said Sir Alarac, writing it all down on a long scroll. "Come, come," said the king impatiently. "Sir Alarac, what do you make of this nonsense?" "Very serious nonsense, your Majesty," answered Sir Alarac. "I will advise you to call in an expert on hats." "Excellent," agreed the king. "Ho, guard! Fetch Sir Snips, and maker of the hats for all the fine lords." Into the throne room marched the smallest man, wearing the tallest hat that Bartholomew had ever seen. It was Sir Snips. Instead of a sword, he wore at his side a large pair of scissors. That's the tall hat. "Take a look at this boy's hat," commanded the king. Sir Snips looked at Bartholomew Cubbins' hat and sniffed in disgust. Then he turned to the king and bowed stiffly. "Your Majesty, I, Sir Snips, am the maker of hats for all the fine lords. I make hats of cloth, of gold, fine silks, and gems, and ostrich plumes. You ask me what I think of this hat? Pooh! It is the most ordinary hat I have ever set my eyes on." "In that case," said the king, "it should be very simple for you to take it off." "Simple indeed," mumbled Sir Snips haughtily, and standing on his tiptoes, he pushed his pudgy thumb at Bartholomew's hat and knocked it to the floor. Immediately, another one appeared on Bartholomew's head. "Screebies!" screamed Sir Snips, leaning into the air higher than he was tall. Then he turned and ran shrieking out of the throne room. "Dear me," said the king, looking very puzzled. "If Snips can't do it, this must be more than an ordinary hat." 136, wrote Sir Alarac, wrinkling his brow. "Your Majesty, I advise that you call in your wise men." "A fine idea. said the king. "Ho guard, bring me Ned. Ned knows about everything in my kingdom." In came an old man. He looked at the hat on Bartholomew's head and looked at the pile of hats on the floor. "Ned, my wise man, can you take off his hat?" asked the king. Ned shook his head solemnly. Solemnly, no. "Then fetch me the father of Ned," commanded the king. "He knows about everything in all my kingdom and all the world beyond." In came an even older man, but when he looked at Bartholomew's hats, the father of Ned merely locked his fingers across his beard and said nothing. That's the really old man. The father of this old man. Neither one of them knew what to do. "Then bring me the father of Ned," ordered the king. "He knows about everything in all my kingdom, in all the world beyond, and in all other worlds that may happen to be." Then came the oldest man of them all, but he just looked at Bartholomew and nibbled nervously on the end of his beard. "Does this mean there is no one in my whole kingdom who can take off this boy's hat?" bellowed the king in a terrifying voice. A small voice came up through the balcony window. "What's the matter, Uncle Derwent?" To Bartholomew, it sounded like the voice of a boy. The king stepped out on the balcony and leaned over the marble. "There is a boy in here, just about your age," the king said. "He won't take off his hat." And there's the little boy. Bartholomew tiptoed up behind the king and looked down. There stood a boy with a big lace collar. A very proud little boy with his nose in the air. It was the Grand Duke Wilfred, nephew of the king. "You send him down here," said the Grand Duke Wilfred. "I'll fix him." The king thought for a minute. He pushed back his crown, scratched his head. "Well, maybe you can. There's no harm in trying." "Take him to the Grand Duke Wilfred," commanded the king, and the two of the king's own guards led Bartholomew out of the throne room. "Who?" said the Grand Duke Wilfred, looking at Bartholomew's new hat, and laughed meaningly. "That hat won't come off. You stand over there." He pointed to a corner where the wall curved out. "I need a little target practice with my bow and arrow." When Bartholomew saw that the Grand Duke Wilfred had only a child's bow, he didn't feel frightened. He spoke up proudly. "I can shoot with my father's big bow." "My bow's plenty big enough for shooting hats, especially hats like yours," answered Wilfred, and he let the arrow fly. It grazed Bartholomew's forehead and nipped off his hat. Away it blew and over the parapet, but another hat appeared on his head. The arrows flew till the Grand Duke's whole bag full of arrows was gone, and still a hat sat upon Bartholomew's head. Look at him flying off the balcony with arrows in them. "It's not fair," cried the Grand Duke. "It's not fair." He threw down his bow and stomped on it. 154 hats, gulped Sue Erlach. "These hats are driving me mad," the king's voice rang out through all the palace. "Why waste my time with this child's bow and arrow? Fetch me the mightiest bow and arrow in all my realm. Fetch the yeoman of the bowmen." "Yeoman of the bowmen," echoed the lords and the noblemen of the court. There he is. A gigantic man strode out across the terrace. His bow was as big as the branch of a tree. The arrow was twice as long as Bartholomew, and thicker than his wrist. It's pretty big. Yeoman of the bowmen, said the king, shoot off this boy's hat and make it stay off. Bartholomew was trembling so hard he could scarcely stand straight. The yeoman bent back his mighty bow. Like a mad giant hornet, the arrow tore away through the air toward Bartholomew Cubbins. The sharp arrow head bit through his hat and carried it off, on and on for a full half a mile. It plunked into the stump of a heart of an old oak tree. Yet there Bartholomew's head sat, another hat. The face of the yeoman of the bowmen went white as the palace walls. It's black magic, he shrieked. Black magic? That's just what it is, sighed the king with relief. I should have thought of that before. It makes things simple. Back to the throne room. Call in my magicians. In the whole throne room, there wasn't a sound as loud as a breath. But from the spiral stairs that led down from the southwest tower came a shuffling of slow padded feet. The magicians were coming, low and slow. They were chanting words that were strange. Dig a hole 5 furlongs deep, down to where the night snakes creep. Mix and mold the mystic mud. Mulber, bulber, titter, tud. In came 7 black-gowned magicians, and beside each one stalked a lean black cat. They circled around Bartholomew Cubbins, muttering deep and mysterious sounds. Stop this useless muttering, ordered the king. I want a chant that will charm this boy's hat. The magicians huddled over Bartholomew and chanted, Winkabus, Tinkabus, Fortune, clay, hat on this demon's head, fly away. Howl, men, howl away, howl away, howl away. Yowl, cats, yowl away, yowl away, yowl away. Hat on this demon's head, seep away, creep away, leap away, leap away. Never come back. A mighty good chant, said the king, looking very pleased. Are you sure it will work? All the magicians nodded together. But, said the king, looking puzzled, there still seems to be a hat upon his head. How long will it take for the charm to work? Be calm, O sire, and have no fears, chanted the magicians. Our charm will work in 10 short years. 10 years, gasped the king. Away, fools, he shouted. Out of my sight. I can't wait 10 years to get rid of his hat. Oh dear, what can I do? What can I do? If I were king, whispered the Grand Duke Wilfred, I'd chop off his head. A dreadful thought, said the king, biting his lip, but I'm afraid I'll have to. Young man, he said to Bartholomew Cubbins, and pointed to a small door at the end of the room, march down those steps to the dungeon and tell the executioner to chop off your head. Oh my goodness! Bartholomew's heart sank into his boots, but he did as the king commanded. I must take off my hat, he said to himself as he stared down the long black stairway. This is my last chance. One hat after another has tore from his head. 156, 157, 158. It grew colder and damper. 217, 218, 219. Down, down, down. 231, 232, 233. It seemed to Bartholomew he must be in the very heart of the mountain. "Who's there?" said a voice from the blackness. Bartholomew turned the corner and stepped into the dungeon. The executioner was whistling and swinging his axe idly because at the moment he had nothing to do. In spite of his business, he really seemed to be a very pleasant man. "The king says you must chop off my head," said Bartholomew. "Oh, I'd hate to," said the executioner, looking at him with a friendly smile. "You seem like such a nice boy." "Well, the king says you have to," said Bartholomew, "so please get it over with." "All right," sighed the executioner, "but first you'll have to take off your hat." "Why?" asked Bartholomew. "I don't know," said the executioner, "but it's one of the rules. I can't execute anyone without his hat on." With his hat on. "I can't execute anyone with his hat on." "All right," said Bartholomew. "You take it off for me." The executioner leaned across the chopping block and flipped off Bartholomew's hat. Boing. "What's this?" he gasped, blinking through the holes in his mask, as another hat sat on Bartholomew's head. He flipped this one off, then another, then another. See them all on the ground there? Ah! "Fiddlesticks!" grunted the executioner, throwing his axe on the floor. "Can't execute you at all." And he shook hands with Bartholomew and sent him back upstairs to the king. The king had been taking a nap on the throne. "What are you doing back here?" he asked of Bartholomew angrily. "I'm sorry, your majesty," explained Bartholomew. "My head can't come off with my hat on. It's against the rules." "So it can't," said the king, leaning back wearily. "Now how many hats does that make altogether?" "The executioner knocked off 13, and I left 178 more on the dungeon steps," answered Bartholomew. 346 hats, mumbled Sir Allernack from behind his scroll. "Uncle Derwin," yawned the Grand Duke Wilfrid, "I suppose I'll have to do away with him. Send him up to the highest turret, and I, in person, will push him off." "Wilfrid, I'm surprised at you," said the king, "but I guess it's a good idea." So the king and the Grand Duke led Bartholomew Cubbins toward the highest turret. Up and up and up the turret stairs he climbed behind them. "This is my very last chance," thought Bartholomew. He snatched off his hat. 347, he snatched off another. He pulled and tore as he flung them behind him. 398, 399. His arms ached from pulling off his hats, but still the hats came. Bartholomew climbed on. 448, 449, 450, counted Sir Allernack, puffing up the stairs behind him. Oh my goodness, look at that. Suddenly, Sir Allernack stopped. He looked, he took off his triangular spectacles and wiped them on his sleeve. And then he looked again. The hats began to change. He had 451, had not one but two feathers. Hat 452 had 3 feathers, and 453 also had 3 and a little red jewel. Each new hat was fancier than the hat just before it. Your Majesty, cried out Sir Allernack. But the king and the guard duke were way up where they couldn't hear. They had already reached the top of the highest turret. Bartholomew was following just behind. Step right out here and get out on that wall, snapped the Grand Duke Wilfrid. I can't wait to push you off. See how the hats are changing? Changing. Look at that one. Changing as they go up the stairs. But when Bartholomew stepped up on the wall, they gasped in amazement. He was wearing the most beautiful hat that had ever been seen in the kingdom of Did. It had a ruby larger than any the king himself had ever owned. It had ostrich plumes and cockatoo plumes and mockingbird plumes and paradise plumes. Besides such a hat, even the king's crown seemed like nothing. The Grand Duke Wilfrid took quite a quick step forward. Bartholomew thought his end had come at last. "Wait!" shouted the king. He could not take his eyes off the magnificent hat. "I won't wait," said the Grand Duke, talked back to the king. "I'm going to push him off now. The new big hat makes me madder than ever." And he flung out his arms to push Bartholomew off. But the king was quicker than Wilfrid. He grabbed him by the back of his fine lace collar. "This is to teach you," His Majesty said sternly, "that Grand Duke never talks back to their king." And he turned the Grand Duke Wilfrid over his knee and spanked him soundly right on the seat of his royal silk pants. "And now," smiled the king, lifting Bartholomew down from the wall, "it would be nice if you'd sell me that wonderful hat." $4.89, $4.99, broke in the tired voice of Sir Alarac, who had just arrived at the top of the steps. "And that," he pointed to the hat of Bartholomew's head, "makes exactly 500. "500!" exclaimed the king. "Will you sell it for 500 pieces of gold?" "Anything you say, sire," answered Bartholomew. "You see, I've never sold one before." The king's hands trembled with joy as he reached for the hat. Slowly, slowly, Bartholomew felt the weight of the great hat lifting from his head. He held his breath. Then suddenly he felt a cool evening breeze blow through his hair. His face broke into a happy smile. The head of Bartholomew Cubbins was bare. "Look, your Majesty, look!" he shouted to the king. "No, you look at me," answered the king, and he put the great hat on right over his crown. Arm in arm, the king and Bartholomew went down to the counting room to count out gold. Then the king sent Bartholomew home to his parents. No basket on his arm, no hat on his head, but with 5 pieces of gold in a bag. That's quite a hat, isn't it? And the king commanded that the hat he had bought, and all the other hats too, be kept forever in a great crystal case by the side of his throne. But neither Bartholomew Cubbins, nor King Derwin himself, nor anyone else in the kingdom of Did could ever explain how the strange thing happened. They only could say, it just happened to happen, and was not very likely to happen again. And there's Bartholomew walking with his 500 pieces of gold in a bag. The end. What an interesting story. Oh my goodness. He came so close to almost getting his head chopped off. And he went through the whole kingdom, dropping head after head after head. And then all of a sudden, mysteriously, the head started getting bigger. What a story. Very interesting. I very much enjoyed it. And I hope that you enjoyed it as well. I hope wherever you are, whether you're in bed sleeping now, getting ready to go to bed, all tucked in, whether you're getting up in the morning to go to school, or whether it's a Saturday or a Sunday and you're getting ready to go out and play with your friends. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope you know that Grandma Dee loves you very much. You're very special. And I hope you will come back next time as we read the 3rd story in our book, Horton Hatches the Egg. This is going to be a wonderful story, and I hope that you will enjoy it with me. And so for now, sending you warm, warm hugs and butterfly kisses. I hope to see you soon. You have a wonderful evening and a wonderful day tomorrow. So, Grandma D will say bye bye for now.